Welcome to the History of Nerds Now podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Pulitzer Prize winner Megan Marshall joins me to talk her new book, Afterlives. Afterlives is really difficult to categorize. It's a little bit biography, a little bit memoir, a little bit travelogue. It's one of those books that stuck with me. I was still thinking about it days later after I finished it, and I was so excited to talk to Megan about it. Pulitzer Prize winner, professor at Emerson College. I just had such a great conversation with her, so how about I shut up? Let's go. And here we are with author Megan Marshall, Afterlives, on biography and the mysteries of the human heart. Megan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
It's an honor for me because I looked this up. It's not just that you won a Pulitzer, right? Your first biography that you wrote was a Pulitzer finalist. Then the second one, you win it. So I've asked every other Pulitzer Prize winner that's been on here, how big was the party that night? Did you get 5 kegs? Are you more of a wine drinker? How'd it go?
Well, you know what you say about having been a finalist for my book, The Peabody Sisters, which took 20 years to write. That was in 2005. It was 2014 when I finally won. I had no hope of it. I thought The Peabody Sisters, it was my big book. So when my editor called on the day that they announced it, there's no warning. You don't find out you're a finalist and then maybe you'll win it. There's no warning. She called me in the afternoon. She said, Megan, I thought she had bad news, like I was being sued or something. She said, you have won the Pulitzer. And I didn't believe her. It took me a while to believe her. And then I am such a history nerd. I was in the middle of a new book, the book about Elizabeth Bishop, and I had a tight deadline. And I thought, damn, I'm going to have to stop working on this book and be a Pulitzer winner. It was really my first reaction. That's how into the work I am. But really the best celebration was the president of Emerson College, Lee Pelton, who's a really brilliant man. He's retired a few years ago, wanted to give me a party. And that's the party we had in the presidential house on Beacon Hill, and with nice food and all my friends and all the faculty that I knew. And it was really spectacular and quite refined, I would say.
It's kind of about the book that I love so much is there's a possibility that you can become one of those super fancy people who would write a book that's be like, I'm so wonderful, here's how wonderful I am and everything. But that's not what Afterlives is. What was your germ of an idea for Afterlives? What kind of started it where you said, hey, this is what this book is going to be?
Well, it crystallized as Afterlives about halfway through the process. And it's important to understand the title. Afterlives is really the time after I'd written these 3 big biographies. As I said, I was quite, nose to the grindstone all that time, even though it was many, many years. And when I finished the 3rd of them, I just had it with deadlines. And it was also, we'll talk about this later, a time when my partner was rather sick and the world was changing. And I just felt so distracted and so worried about things. And I didn't feel I wanted to take on a big other project. So I began to write these essays, which were kind of short takes, but they were still very much a biographical approach. So the first one was the one that's called The Second Man in the Front Row, about my grandparents in World War I, Paris. Then I wrote the one about Kyoto, and then I wrote the one about Jonathan Jackson. We'll talk about all of these, but that was over a few years, and suddenly I began to think maybe there's some way I could put all of these together in a book, and that's when I came up with the title Afterlives and the title essay Afterlives. But interestingly, those early essays had the phrase afterlife in them. Some of them did. My grandparents, they'd survived the war and they thought we're the best in a good position to stay here in Europe and help in the afterlife after the war. And in the Kyoto essay, one of the professors that I met when I was there on a special fellowship, he told me about his uncle who had been a equivalent of a kamikaze. He was supposed to power a boat into some target and give his life to the emperor. But the war ended and he never did have to, sacrifice his life, although he'd kind of considered himself dead from the moment he was given that assignment. And then he said his whole life after that, he thought of as an afterlife, decades that he lived longer. So those words were important to me. And I began to think about, how I could put together a collection of what I really thought of as sort of like short stories. I thought people can publish short story collections. Why can't I publish a collection of rather different, as I thought of it then, explorations into different periods of history and different issues that had preoccupied me? And I collected them together. And then I began to see that actually this was kind of an autobiography, a memoir. How did I become a biography? What is biography to me? And how can we understand our lives better through the lives of others?
Your perspective on this, it really threw me at first because the first few chapters, right, they are essays, but there is that connection. And ultimately, like, you're the character that's in every single one of them somehow. But what I kind of didn't expect is that, yes, you're there, but your point of view is always outwards, right? There is a lot of somebody who is accomplished as you might sit there and say, as I said before, I'm fancy. Let me tell everybody how fancy I am. But each one of these essays, and I can't wait to get to chapter 1, because I mean, that just kind of starts it off. You're constantly looking externally. Was that just you started putting pen to paper, you started putting finger to keyboard, and that's how you wrote? Or was that something you thought about, hey, this is how I want to present this?
I think that's the biographical impulse, really. The biographer doesn't want to stand in front of the subject. And even though I was looking at my own life or my grandparents or my father or a friend, it still was about them. And what could I learn about me from studying their life? I start with a quotation from Gamaliel Bradford, who's an old-time biographer, but he said, we're all biographers from childhood, all of us, in that we're constantly looking at the lives of those around us in order to figure out how we want to live, mistakes we don't want to make, or what we might be inspired to do based on what someone has done that we've witnessed. So it's in that spirit, really, that I wrote all of these essays, which are personal, and sometimes they are revealing about me, but more so about the others that I'm writing about. And I love research, and I love the way, things come together, things fall into place the more you look and the more you poke around. And I mean, for example, I just, skipping ahead to the essay about high school for me and my high school classmate, Jonathan Jackson, who gave his life in what I guess we'd have to say was an ill-advised attempt to free his brother from prison in a hostage-taking scheme. But I was thinking about that period, and I remembered that was the year that we got out of school at 1:15 because there was this budget crisis in Pasadena where I grew up, and they cut one of the periods out of the school day. And what were we doing at 1:15? I mean, we would never do that now. Or maybe if we did, there would be an after-school program for people to go to, or sports. There weren't girls' sports in those days, so we're just off on the streets and all kinds of things happened. And, small things make big history.
And even right now, we kind of touched on this right before we hit record. It's got to be hard. You're promoting this book now. It's about to come out. But the areas that you're talking about right now are dealing with a huge natural disaster, the LA fires.
Yes.
That's got to just wear on you a little bit because obviously you're going to be talking about this book a lot. How do you feel about doing this? Does this almost feel a little bit cathartic that you can talk about these wonderful things while something so bad is going on?
Well, it is very sad, more than sad, tragic, the loss of homes and some lives in the Altadena fire. That is the place of my childhood, the place of my father's childhood. It's a location in two of the essays, the one about my grandparents who were in Paris, and this is the home that they returned to. I guess, I think people didn't really know much about Pasadena or Altadena, and now they certainly do. And here I can fill in some lives that were lived there, and maybe that will help a little bit with the mourning process to have these places held up as important as communities, which of course the people living in them, they don't need to be told that, but the world may need to be told that. So much more attention is going to Pacific Palisades with all these, not that there's any comparison to be made, but, the rich and the famous, that's Pacific Palisades. Altadena is one of the last remaining middle-class communities, and it's, burned out. Can it be restored as that? Can those people find homes again where they had their homes? And, my grandparents' house, they built it in 1923 when there wasn't much up there. And I've been looking at photographs of it and I see how empty it was. That house seems to have survived. The flames skipped over it. It's not been in my family since the 1980s, but I don't know. I almost feel as if it stayed there because I wrote about it.
Maybe. We can either prove it or disprove it. Well, because especially it is really part of your book to the way you present the area, which is, quintessential American, that, as you said, middle class. And it's an important part of this, right? That, the Jonathan Jackson chapter where it's just, this is kind of part of America. And this is what happened. It's not like it's some sort of super special area that had this happen and this happen. This is a place where any of these things could happen, that it looked a lot like the rest of America.
Yes. And that's what we need to know about all of our lives. Our lives are places where anything can happen and important things can happen. And we better be, watching so that we can be witness to those things.
And I think this chapter, especially the way it ends, is kind of a perfect example of what the book is. As you said, as a biographer, don't stand in the way. And I think another aspect of great biographies is you don't tell the reader what this person is. You show them who they are. And I mean, this chapter, you could have gone on a diatribe about this or that, or about how we should feel about Jonathan Jackson, whereas you just present the story and you say how you reacted in that time, and you talk about the speech, but it's not an essay telling people like, this is how you should think and this is how we should remember, but more of that we just need to remember and not tell you how to remember it.
Well, yes. And what's fortunate in this and all of the essays is that there's evidence. George's letters, that's where the title I was going to say comes from. George says maybe Jonathan was free for a while in the moment that he took charge of that courtroom, which was more than George, or many others could say. And then there are Jonathan's own, he wrote for the campus underground paper, and he wrote letters to his brother that his brother could quote in later books. And so we hear Jonathan's voice, we hear George's voice, we hear Angela Davis's voice in her wonderful autobiography. And that's what you can do with history, particularly with biography. I'm always interested in the voices of the people I'm writing about, and I've been very lucky to have that kind of material. And I really that's kind of what Afterlives is about as well, is realizing that I had documents, I had letters, I had journals of my own family that I had been ignoring while I was writing about the Peabody sisters, Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Bishop, who fascinated me, often for kind of personal reasons. I was working out my own questions and dilemmas through an engagement with their lives, but I was ignoring my own family papers, which were really quite rich and surprisingly so to me.
And there's a couple of chapters that touch on family history, and this is something I always wanted to ask somebody like yourself. You write a biography about somebody who's long gone, that is not personally connected to you. But with this, you have to dig into your own family's lives, and some of it's not necessarily pretty. Some of it is not positive things. As you're writing this, do you kind of say, hey, maybe I don't want, my grandfather or somebody to kind of look bad because of his point of view on something? Is there a part of you that says, I don't want to air this dirty laundry, so to speak? Or does the biographer in you say, I have to tell the story wherever it takes me?
I think I have a passion for the truth, and the truth is always so humbling and moving, and it's so much more interesting than some kind of glossed over version of things. A big part of the essay about my grandparents in World War I Paris comes from a diary that my grandmother kept while there. I mean, there's things that might have been embarrassing to her, such as she had just gotten married and she became pregnant, and she had no idea that you would miss your period and that would mean you were pregnant. She had to go to a doctor to be told that, and there she is, a woman in her early 20s. This was a different era. People didn't understand things. So she had shown me this diary when she was still alive. But after she died, my aunt, her daughter, was really just wanted to throw it away because it was personal. And I thought, my God, this is a record of a life. And it's full of, like at the end, there are all these accounts about what things cost in Paris every day. Everything she spent is there. It's just so valuable and precious, even if you aren't her granddaughter. So I understand what you're saying. There's a sense, people would even ask me this about the biographical subject I was writing about, the Peabody sisters. How can you read their private letters? Well, this is what people have left to us so we can understand the lives of the past. And yes, in this case, I got sad in a different kind of way sometimes reading about, my parents' difficult marriage or, the hardships that, interestingly, it was harder for my grandparents I mean, they were in their 20s. Still, I call them my grandparents. But when they returned from this war-torn Europe to Kansas, their home city, things actually got worse for them there than they had been in wartime Paris. And tragedies happened within the family. And reading about them in the letters, you just feel for them.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that you're bringing out for your family. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the cover of the book. It's gorgeous. Can you just describe what is on the cover of the book and where did it come from?
Yes. Well, one of the essays called Left-Handed is about how when I was little, I looked around me and saw my mother and my aunt, and both grandmothers were all left-handed. And that must mean that all women are left-handed. I didn't turn out to be, but a big portion of that essay is about my left-handed mother, who was a very talented and capable artist in her college years and just after. And the image on the cover is a self-portrait of her that I had never known about growing up. My sister found it in a storage space, actually, just shortly before I started writing that article, the essay. So I hadn't known about this. And the curious thing is my mother, whose left hand was so skilled as an artist, nevertheless felt very kind of disabled by this left-handedness and awkward about it and physically awkward. And she would ask to be seated at the end of the table so she wouldn't bump into people over dinner and that sort of thing. She's actually painted herself in this self-portrait right-handed. And that's part of what I puzzle through in this. What did that mean for an artist to be able to, in a certain way, reshape herself in a self-portrait? Give herself this forward-moving right hand that she didn't have in real life. I'm so pleased that you like this portrait and her story, a big part of her story. And this is what I kind of go into about my interest as a biographer in lives of women who may not necessarily have accomplished all you might want for them because of the times they lived in or other kinds of difficulties that came to them. And so my mother's very promising art career, which I learned much more about in reading her letters in the last few years, working on this essay, she was very quiet about it in a way because I think she was sorry and disappointed in herself that it didn't amount to more. I found more information about how far along she really was at the point at which she kind of stepped back from the ambition that had driven her through college and the few years afterwards. And I feel very proud of being able to bring her artwork to a world that she could never have imagined. She died at 68 in 1991 before I had finished my first biography. So she never read any of my biographies. And now she's on the cover of my fourth biographical work.
This chapter, Left-Handed, really jumps out to me because my father was left-handed. We constantly called him Sinister. We really had fun with that. But he was also a self-taught artist himself.
Really?
Went to Vietnam. He worked in the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, but he could just paint. And my grandmother had some of his, he was 8 or 9 years old and could draw a picture of a child. And it's just all the detail is there. Meanwhile, I'm right-handed. I cannot draw a stick figure to save my life. My two brothers are a little bit better, but none of us had the skill he had. And just reading the left-handed and the things that you're talking about, how left-handed people, especially back in the day, they would try and almost beat it out of you, sometimes literally.
Yes.
No one was going to tell him what to do. He was going to be left-handed his whole time. But it's just very funny that left-handed and that artistic innate ability, that chapter really hit me hard personally.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm very glad to hear it. Yes.
I'd be remiss because while Left-Handed is a great chapter, this one starts out, now I'm going to make it clear, you are not a coroner or anything, but this first chapter deals with you and human remains. Can you tell me just a little bit about the essay that starts off the book?
That is indeed true. I don't know if there are any other biographers who have been able to open the lid of the coffin on one of their subjects, but I had that opportunity. This was back in 2006, and it took me all this time to think it was okay to write about it because it seemed like a very, kind of private experience. But I began to think, if I can't write about that, I mean, surely people want to read about it. I'd better do it. So what happened was I wrote this biography of the Peabody sisters. There were 3 of them. One of them, Sophia, married Nathaniel Hawthorne, famously romantic marriage. And Sophia had been an artist herself, although I don't think she was left-handed. Nathaniel Hawthorne died in 1864, around the age 60, and Sophia and her 3 children were living on the kind of meager royalties from his Scarlet Letter, successful as it was, and House of Seven Gables, and they decided to move to Europe and ultimately to London to live perhaps a little bit more economically. And that's where Sophia died in London, and her daughter Una died in London as well in the 1870s, and were buried there in a big cemetery called Kensal Green. And when I was writing the Peabody Sisters, I went over to London to, visit the graves. This is what you do. And there was a beautiful hawthorn tree in bloom. I happened to get there at the right time, sheltering these stones. And I shed my tear and thought, this was the end of it. That's where they ended up. But shortly after that book was published, one of the 3 Hawthorne children, Rose, had later in life become a nun and founded an order that was devoted to caring for impoverished cancer patients. And this order in Hawthorne, New York, the Rosary Hill Home, a Dominican order, they had the responsibility of tending these graves in Kensal Green for Rose's mother and sister. Evidently, the hawthorn tree fell down and broke the stones, and they thought, let's take this opportunity to reinter the remains of Sophia and Una in Concord, Massachusetts, right by Nathaniel Hawthorne on Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where there's also Emerson and Thoreau and the Alcotts, and why not get them all there? And they wanted to publicize this a bit because they would like to have Rose be canonized, become a saint. So anyway, they got me involved. And to my surprise, they invited me and one of the Hawthorne descendants, a poet, Allison Deming, to come to the Rosary Hill Home in Hawthorne, New York. And they said, wouldn't you like to be there when they stop off here on the way to Sleepy Hollow? And I said, well, I guess so. And then suddenly I'm in this Rosary Hill Home in a kind of hospital setting, but very home-like. And, Sister Mary Joseph says to Allison and me, well, I'm going to leave you alone with this. It was just one little child-sized coffin to commune. And then she said that she's leaving. You can open the lid if you want.
For somebody who didn't believe the phone call saying you won the Pulitzer, I'm guessing you were kind of like, she's kidding, right? Which, by the way, after going to 13 years of Catholic school that was taught by Dominican nuns, they never kid, but go ahead.
No, I don't think they did. In fact, she gave us a little heads up about what we might see, which wasn't going to be much. But I turned to Allison, who was the blood relative. I didn't think this should be my decision. And she lifted the lid. And should I say? Well, I don't know how much I should say.
Go ahead. It's chapter 1. We're not giving away too much.
Okay. I'll say a little more. So there was, a little, as the nun had said, Sister Mary Joseph, so it would be a little bit of cloth and a few fragments of bone. And we also, there was a Maltese cross that was a little tarnished. But most striking of all were these 2 heads of hair, Sophia's salt and pepper gray and Una's auburn reddish hair in braids, long, thick braids, both of them. And what I didn't say actually in the book is that this room we were in was a kind of exhibit place for the founding of the convent. And Rose's braid was under glass in a vitrine in this same room. She had cut it off when she became a nun, so it was in a coil. There was her kind of dark red braid, Una's brighter red braid, and Sophia's salt and pepper gray. It was eerie. And then the next day I thought, wait a minute, this is wrong, because as I think I mentioned earlier, Una had died young in her early 30s. And the story on this, which was put forth by her brother, was that she had wasted away, her hair had turned white, and she had died in an Anglican convent. Poor Una. Well, suddenly I knew she had not wasted away, at least in that sense. And I had always been very interested in Una, who was the oldest of the Hawthorne children. She was 5 or 6 years old when Nathaniel was writing the Scarlet Letter, and very much the model for little Pearl, who's the kind of elf child in that book. And I hope at least some of your listeners have read the Scarlet Letter, and they know that Pearl is the illegitimate child of Hester Prynne and the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale. And she really is a sprightly figure who represents all this, the wildness of that love. So I had known about the early death of Una, and of course read this, what I even then I thought was kind of hooey about her hair turning white. But then I thought, well, maybe she'd been anorexic, or something. But that doesn't turn your hair white. It just, you might lose your hair. I was always puzzled by it. And this moment confronted by the fact that someone was making up something about this caused me to investigate and learn more about Una and her life as she grew older. And I'm not going to spoil this for people because I think you'll enjoy reading my speculations and what I found out and what I couldn't find out, because sometimes you can't find out.
Well, Megan, I'd like to ask a very intelligent and sophisticated question. Were you worried about a Hawthorne curse? Were you thinking maybe there's going to be a ghost tonight because I opened up a coffin? Are you seeing ghosts right now?
Maybe that's going to happen after the publication date. Now you got me worried.
I didn't do it. I didn't open it. You can't put this on me.
I think they rid themselves of the curse. I think Nathaniel did that in the, by writing those books, The Scarlet Letter and particularly The House of Seven Gables, which, the curse is lifted by the end of that book. So I'm not going to worry about it.
The other chapter, and this might be my favorite chapter, is you end up going to Japan to work at a university, be kind of visiting professor. What I really loved about this one is you really laughed at yourself a lot during this because you're like, hey, I showed up to Japan at the wrong time. I showed up and everybody's like, why are you here now? And then your partner Scott comes over and you're like, oh, the leaves are going to be great. Oh, no, wait, this is the completely wrong time. And I really appreciate that. And again, was that something where you're like, hey, I'm going to have a little fun with myself. You got to put it all out there. Is it almost kind of a release valve because of heaviness to it that comes, and we'll talk about that. But is that kind of what pops out at you when you go to Japan? You're like, I'm completely out of my element here.
Well, Japan is both the most wild and the most civilized place at the same time. But there's also a kind of humor that maybe a sort of poking fun at oneself kind of humor that I experienced in a lot of the people that I met as well. In fact, I think that one of the people I met who's in this book is the great translator of Emily Dickinson, Masako Takeda. And she explained it was very hard to translate Dickinson because gender and first person and all those things are not part of the way the Japanese language works. So maybe there is a kind of humility that's just, there in the language and in the culture. But I think, I talked about how I was like that, oh no, the Pulitzer, I'm going to have to stop working. I mean, I was kind of working up to the very last minute before I got there to Japan on my Elizabeth Bishop biography, which had just come out. And I really had no opportunity to prepare for being in Japan. And I was there as a visiting professor in American literature, so I didn't really need to know Japan, but the whole situation was actually pretty comical. And as you mentioned, I thought, well, I'll go for the fall semester. That must be September through November. The very polite professor who said, okay, that's fine, didn't inform me. And why would he have that the calendar, the academic calendar is entirely different in Japan. You teach from, October through maybe middle of February, and then there's a big break for cherry blossom season. And then they're teaching school through the summer and it's really hot there. So when I arrived on, September 1st, I had to go like from 1 to 30, it's like very dramatic. I had to be right on the first of the month of whatever month it was. And I got there and I found out that, the university wasn't open, wouldn't be open for another month. And the professors who were going to help me out weren't even anywhere near there. So I had this whole month of kind of trying to figure out how to be in Japan. But it was a very important time for me. I had never lived outside of the country before. I had always wanted to do that, but I didn't have a junior year abroad. I couldn't afford that. And I applied for fellowships, but didn't get them, and I'm not sure I would have chosen Japan. I probably would have wanted to go to France because I'd studied French in high school, but it couldn't have been a better place and it couldn't have been more different. And I think this combination of the wild and the civilized was so powerful to me. Actually, the one place it reminded me of most was Pasadena while I was there. It was very much an outside kind of experience. The campus had all these, what we would call pergolas when we were, we had lunch in the pergola. And when I was in junior high, outside, I never once ate in a cafeteria indoors from first grade to senior year. That was just, who would do that?
New Yorkers, that's who would do it.
It felt kind of like home, and a lot of the vegetation and the smells, it was very much like Southern California in that sense. And of course, the Southern Californians, the architecture was quite influenced by Japan, the arts and crafts houses of the Green and Green brothers, which I think have mostly survived that fire. While I was there, I was, there to be an American literature professor, and I had just before going there, it was Thoreau's 200th birthday in July 2017. And I'd been at a big conference in Concord about that and met some Japanese scholars. And one of them talked about the Thoreau of Japan and showed some slides of a little replica of a hut, just the way there's a replica of Thoreau's cabin and the parking lot at Walden, if you've ever been there. Kind of early on, as I didn't know anybody there, but a friend of a friend had a friend, and we had coffee. This person was an American, but she lived in Japan all her adult life. I said, "What do you know about this Kamo no Chomei, the Thoreau of Japan?" She said, "Oh, well, he lived just right across the river here, and his hut was out not too far outside of Kyoto, and his book, Hojoki, which is called The 10-Foot Square Hut, that's very well translated. You can read it." So I go right to the library. The library, at least, was open, and get a copy of it. And I'm just fascinated by this tale of a 12th century Buddhist hermit who, decides to leave the civilized life of the court, where he's a poet and might have been a, important functionary, but was kind of passed over, and instead goes out to what by the end of my time there, I was there for 3 months. First, I go see the replica of the hut, which is on the grounds of the shrine where his father had been a dignitary. I should say there's this amazing river that runs through Kyoto, the Kamo. It's unlike any, city with a river running through it. I live in Boston. There's the Charles River. You can walk along the banks and it's kind of pretty much the same level the whole time, or the Seine or the Thames. But here's this, there are people like in their waders fishing in this river. And if it rains, it rises. If the rain's let up, it's low again. They have little stones that you can walk across the river on these stones. I mean, who would let you do that around here? That would be incredible. Anyway, so I see the hut and I read his book and think about him. And I think also about my partner, Scott, who I had left behind. He needed to work, came to visit for a little while, but his health wasn't great. And that became an increasing concern while I was there. And that is part of what is in this essay, the sense of impermanence that the Buddhist thought or religion teaches one to embrace, really. And this is what Kamo no Chomei, after having lived through huge floods, huge fires, huge plagues, and retreats just to commune with the natural world and think his thoughts, and to learn how to live a solitary life with some equanimity, which became a lesson for me as I first faced the death of my partner in 2019. And then not long after that, the pandemic came and forced me, suddenly living alone for the first time, to be far more solitary than I had ever imagined I would need to learn how to be.
And definitely towards the end of the book, Scott and his loss becomes a big part of that. Was writing about Scott hard? Was it cathartic? Was it a little bit of both? And I have to say, you absolutely got me. And we're not going to say it. I definitely want people to read it the way I did. He had a very particular line that you remember specifically, that the emotional slap in the face that chapter gave me, I didn't see it coming. Did it help writing? Was it really hard to get through, or was it cathartic for you?
Well, I couldn't have written that right away, but by the time I was writing it, some of the essays in this book are kind of a narrative. They have a chronology to them. There's a story, a historical episode I'm narrating, but others of them are more, something comes to me and I just keep going from there. More like writing a poem, I guess, which I used to do long ago. Actually, I didn't know how much Scott would be in it. One of the things that happened when he came to visit, he was such an interesting person. It's been 5 years now, and I keep learning more about him. And that's one of the things I think you find when someone you love dies. The relationship doesn't end. You keep learning more about them. And maybe sometimes you regret you didn't know that when they were alive. But in this case, there I was being me, having some obligations on the campus. And he was just there for 10 days and we had gone on some excursions and he really wanted to go to Hiroshima. And I had been once before. This whole invitation to be there for 3 months was the outgrowth of having given some talks in Japan a few years before. And I was just there for about a week. And I did go to Hiroshima because one of the faculty members who invited me over taught there. But Scott really wanted to go, and he wanted to go to the memorial for the bomb. he could get it. He decided just to do this by himself. I didn't really know why. I wasn't thinking about it. He didn't explain exactly. I just thought it was, if he was in Paris, he would go to the Eiffel Tower. And if he was in, Rome, he would go to the Pantheon, and that's just the kind of tourist he was. He had to go. But I realized afterwards, when he started writing some poems about it, he was a paralegal, and that was his profession, or that was how he made money. But all his life was writing poetry, and writing, as I found out after he died, very fine poetry. He hadn't shown me all of it, but he did write a poem about that visit to the memorial. And what I realized was his own grandfather had been on a ship that was one of the first to get close to the bombing site, and had, at least his family believed, they were so close that he'd inhaled the radioactive air and died fairly young of leukemia. And Scott himself was struggling with a lymphoma. So I think in the end, I realized it was kind of a pilgrimage to the place that had his own family history. It was a family exploration for him. But I think, he liked to do things on his own. I don't think he minded going by himself and thinking about it, thinking his own thoughts. But it wasn't until afterwards that I understood why he had to go.
And that's kind of one of the themes, just as you were talking about it, it kind of popped in my head, that aspect of A, looking back and seeing things that you didn't see, but also B, of paying attention in the moment, that things you're just like, that's just how Scott liked to do it. But then that deeper meaning kind of comes when you start to stop and look at something and take the time to kind of dig into it. And, I'm just thinking it through as we're talking, like every essay kind of comes down to that, whether it's...
That's the biographer's lens on life. There's always a story or a story that can be made. And maybe it's just, the way I think about things, but these unexpected links, they're just so delicious when you find them. And then you can't wait to make some kind of story out of them, a narrative, to let the reader experience that delight of kind of coincidence almost.
Well, I'll tell you what, usually the last question, and you've heard the podcast, is about people think nonfiction is boring, why should you read it? We don't have to ask that one anymore. I think that one answers that. So we're just going to skip. I have a different last one for you. I always find it interesting, as somebody who won the Pulitzer, writes these amazing books. Who are kind of your favorite contemporary authors? Or is there any books that coming out that you're personally excited for?
Yeah.
That you would say, hey, if you like my stuff, you should be reading these people?
Well, I have a little stack here.
Perfect.
So I want to say, first of all, the best biography I've read for a very long time is called Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner by Natalie Dykstra. And it's just an amazing work of research, but really more than that, of storytelling. And you just know everything's true in here, but each little chapter is a kind of a gem of a phase or a moment in. And Isabella Stewart Gardner, for those who don't know, she was a great art collector in Boston, and then she founded this museum for all the amazing things that she did collect. Probably people know about the theft of the Vermeer from the Gardner Museum some years ago, and it's never been found, and that's a big story. But this is the woman behind it, and I'll have to say that I had thought of Gardner as a little bit of I don't know. I wasn't all that interested in her, but now I've become passionate about her. I've fallen in love with her. Thanks to Natalie Dykstra.
I read that one, Megan, and I reviewed it, and my review is, the book is so well done.
Yes.
What I saw was the person and her life didn't necessarily hit me and interest me all that much, but what I could recognize was that this was an amazingly written book, because her life wasn't the type that would normally really pull me in, but I still read every page because it's so well written that even the topic didn't hit me. I'm still like, this is still a great book. Like, I can still...
Yes, you're in that world. She takes you into this world and a mind and, So then there are two books that I also read this year, which seem very different, but they have something in common. There's a biography of Catherine White, who was the great editor of fiction and various things at The New Yorker, by Amy Reading, The World She Edited. Catherine White, who was married to E.B. White, who we know, of Charlotte's Web and that sort of thing. But it's a literary life. And then this book, The Icon and the Idealist by Stephanie Gorton, about Margaret Sanger and Mary Ware Dennett and the rivalry that brought birth control to America. These are contemporaries to a large extent. They overlap. And the thing that interested me is all three of these women have very complicated marriages. And their husbands are like philanderers, and they decide to leave them and then have their own lives after that. And yet they don't really know how to do that. There's nobody telling you how to take care of your kids or explain divorce to them or something. It's just this early era of women struggling with the constraints of marriage and the difficult men in their lives and making weird choices. And, it doesn't really matter that one's an editor and one's an activist. That it's the very human story within it that kind of grabbed me. But I also want to say, I'm looking forward to a book by Peniel Joseph. I don't know if you've ever had him on the show. He's a wonderful biographer and historian. He's written biographies of Stokely Carmichael and a book about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But his book coming out in May is called Freedom Season: How 1963 Transformed America's Civil Rights Revolution. He's a great writer. And then there are 3 biographies that are coming out soon after that. Carla Kaplan has a biography of Jessica Mitford, Nicholas Boggs on James Baldwin, and Lance Richardson on Peter Matheson, who wrote The Snow Leopard. So those are literary biographies, which I'm kind of drawn to. And all of those writers have worked a decade or more on these books, some of them much more. And I think they're going to be like Natalie's biography of Gardner. They're going to be very rich and textured and moving, and you'll understand more about these amazing people of the past.
I remember making fun of Debbie Applegate to her face, admittedly to her face. You all love spending a lot of time on these biographies, whereas other people might put out a book every 2 years. You're all like, no, I need time with this.
I don't know if we love it. I don't know. It's true. But it's necessary. Can't do a good job without it.
Now, I need to ask this, right? Because, these are all very, wonderful, lots of value to just the world and great literature. Do you ever get time for trashy TV? Like, is there any guilty pleasure? Are you just reading these really fancy books all the time? Or do you throw on the Real Housewives every now and again just to kind of, zone out?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't own a TV.
Oh, you have to own a computer. You could still go on YouTube.
I know, I understand that, but I also don't. I work standing up. I have a bad back. So I'm like, I can't lie there with my computer on my lap and watch things. I love to read, and I've always loved to read. And I think I was kind of lucky that when I was little, we didn't have a TV till I was 5. So I didn't kind of fall into the habit, although I certainly watched a zillion whatever, Sea Hunt and The Rifleman. And, after school, I watched a lot of TV. But I think I don't like being pinned in place for a half hour or an hour or something like that. I really like to have a kind of flow in my life, even though I do watch the clock, so I can try to get things done. But
how many hours do you spend in a library looking at documents, though? I mean, that's gotta do a lot.
I get out and walk. I play the piano. What are the guilty pleasures? I do the crossword puzzle. What can I say? That's very important to me. I can't get through the day without the New York Times crossword puzzle.
Well, listen, Megan, After Lives is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thanks, Brendan. And thanks for that very insightful review.
And that's it for this episode, Megan. Thank you so much. After Lives, go out and get it, people. Great read. Will make you think. Hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.